Welcome back to the inaugural Decarbonisation Summit at the headquarters of SSE here in Glasgow during COP26. And we return to the Food and Agriculture panel in partnership with the National Trust. Founded in 1895, the National Trust is Europe's largest conservation charity, caring for 250,000 hectares of land on behalf of the UK. And 80% of that land is farmed, as I'm sure we'll find out more from Matt. So how do we best use the resources we have in terms of land when feeding a growing human population? On this panel, we'll be asking our panellists about how we, and indeed they, plan to transition to lower greenhouse gas emissions in the food and agriculture sector. So time to introduce our expert panel for today's discussion. And joining me here in the studio are Professor Matt Hurd, who is a terrestrial ecologist working for the National Trust land assets on nature recovery, climate resilience, and engaging people with natural and historic places. We're also joined by Fotiadis, who is the co-founder and CEO of food tech startup Better Origin, who are tackling the future of food security with the missing link in the food chain, insects. Intriguing, and we look forward to hearing more. Also joining us virtually is Gareth Morgan, Head of Policy, Farming and Land Use at the UK Food and Farming Organic Agriculture body, the Soil Association. And also online, Tessa, Clarke, co-founder of Olio, a pioneering service which unites neighbourhoods and businesses to share surplus food and household goods. And the United Nations Environment Programme's Tim Christophersen joins us. He's the head of Nature for Climate at UNEP. And lastly, here in the studio, Robin Sundaram, who is a responsible sourcing manager for Nestle, leading on the implementation of Nestle's global commitment to engage all suppliers in its responsible sourcing guidelines. As with the format of the Decarbonisation Summit, I'll lead with some questions for our panel to start with, and we'll also have questions from our online audience, and our panel will be invited to ask questions of each other. But first of all, I'd like to ask, and I'll start with perhaps you, Robin, here in the studio. What are you doing at Nestle, obviously a huge and significant global organisation? Give us a sense, a very brief sense, please, of some of the things that you're doing to decarbonise within the business.
Yeah, we are the biggest food and beverage company in the world, and we've done an exercise to look at our global footprint, and the reality is 95% of our footprint is outside of our direct control. It's all scope 3. So the single biggest thing we need to do is to collaborate, to work with both our suppliers and our customers up and down the supply chain. And there are a number of big areas, but the biggest thing we need to do is work on regenerative agriculture with our farmers, because 60% of that footprint is in our ingredient supply chain. So that's the single biggest thing that we can do to make a difference. Our footprint, just to give you an idea of the scale, is twice that of all of Switzerland, which is where our head office is. But we're also working on a number of other things. It's not just about agriculture, it's about our transport. We're transporting stuff all around the world. It's about, we're redoing all our packaging anyway to make it reusable, recyclable. While we do that, why not make it more sustainable from a greenhouse gas perspective? We're also gradually moving our portfolio towards more plant-based. So that's another thing that we're looking at. So there's a number of areas that we're focused on. I'll come onto it later, but specifically in the UK, I'm personally working with 80 dairy farmers, for instance, and I can talk about some of the things that we're doing right now that's actually making a difference already.
Very good. Just a quick note of clarification, if you would. The Decarbonisation Summit is all about reaching out to as wide an audience as possible. And would you mind just clarifying for people who perhaps don't know what regenerative agriculture is, please?
This is really about our farmers, really going back to how we used to farm many years ago. So farming has become really intensive, and we use lots of equipment where we're just we're really ploughing up the soil, and we actually have to minimise the impact on soil. We need to do things like planting cover crops to allow us to sequester or take more carbon back out of the atmosphere, put it back into the ground. We need to stop using pesticides, herbicides. And so how do we start getting some more natural remedies there? And also we need to move away from synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizer, which again causes a lot of issues in terms of the atmosphere through nitrous oxide. And we need to go back to things like manure and natural fertilizers again. So all of these kind of in combination, our farmers changing how they've been farming over the last few years back to more traditional methods.
Thank you very much indeed. perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, not a large global blue chip, but Fotis, to turn to you. You're the CEO of a startup, Better Origin. What are you doing within your business to look to decarbonize?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Very exciting panel. So at Better Origin, we're working with food producers and supermarkets to decarbonize the food supply chain, reduce Scope 3 emissions, and get them to net zero. And we do this with the power of insects and technology. We have built an insect farm in a shipping container. It's fully autonomous. We deploy that on farms, and we convert local wastes into net zero products. More specifically, at the moment, we're working a lot with poultry farmers, and we convert the food waste into live insect feed for chickens, and that equates to net zero eggs. And to give you a rough idea, one of our systems, one of our containers, can mitigate about 574 tons of CO2 emissions per year, and that equates to 123 cars off the road every year. So that's what we're doing in a nutshell.
Thank you very much indeed, Fotis. I mean, a great example of the kind of creative innovation that decarbonisation is throwing up. So thanks for those insights. Tessa, you're also a startup. Could you give us a sense of what you're doing to decarbonise within your business, please?
Yes, so at Olio, we're specifically focused on tackling the problem of food waste. So food waste, if it were to be a country, would be the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the USA and China. And that's because we throw away well over a third of all the food we produce each year. And Olio specifically is focusing on the food waste problem in the home and also at a local business level. And how it works is we have a free app that now has over 5 million members, and we connect them with each other so they can give away rather than throw away their spare food. And that's a sort of neighbour to neighbour, hyper-local sharing experience. We then also have 35,000 trained volunteers. We call them food waste heroes. And we match those volunteers up with their local business, which could be a supermarket, a quick service restaurant, food to go, etc. And those volunteers on their allotted day will pop out of their house across the road. They will pick up all of the unsold food from that business. They will take it home, add it to the app. Within minutes, the neighbours are requesting it. Minutes later, they're popping round and picking it up. And so that takes that food from having been considered a waste stream at that store to instead, on average, within an hour or so, being fully redistributed into multiple homes in the local community. And as a result of this sort of real-time hyper-local sharing network that we've built, we have saved approximately 30 million portions of food. And that has had an environmental impact equivalent to taking 100 million car miles off the road. And we have also saved over 5 billion litres of water, because obviously food production is incredibly water intensive.
Thanks very much indeed, Tessa. Perhaps you're sharing some surplus chickens that have been fed by Fotis's insects. A journey,
Yes.
perhaps you could perhaps map that one out. Jumping then to the other end of the spectrum and looking at the National Trust side of things, Matt, I know the National Trust is doing a lot in this sector. Give us some brief insights into the kinds of things you are doing, please.
Well, so I guess overall, a bit like Nestle, but much smaller in scale, no doubt, is a kind of a root and branch kind of understanding of really where the carbon sort of sits across the whole portfolio of our business, so that we've done sort of tier 1, tier 2 sort of assessments. So we kind of understand the sources, and that sort of sits within our business in terms of kind of the places that we run and the way we manage those, but also on the land. And so really what we're looking at now is having got a baseline is really how to move forward. And we've committed to net zero by 2030 across the board. And obviously that's through a kind of range of strategies, reduction within the way we've managed things, putting in kind of mitigation. So we've committed also to a whole bunch of nature-based solutions. This week at COP, we've kind of announced a big peatland program, but we've also committed to planting 20 million trees that basically to offset those. And then sort of on the land, as you said, we have a lot of land that is both semi-natural and managed for farming, and really looking at kind of how we can innovate those systems. A lot of them are already very extensive, but really looking at how we can blend the best principles of ecological kind of approaches underpinning biodiversity within those systems to try and become carbon zero and beyond, really.
It's just excellent to hear as the UK's largest farmer. It's great to hear that you're doing so much and so fast. Another great British institution, the Soil Association. I know decarbonisation is absolutely central to all of your work, Gareth, but give us a sense of some of the ideas that are flowing through the work of the Soil Association at the moment, please, on this subject of decarbonisation.
Well, it was great to hear Robin expounding on where agriculture needs to move to. And I was thinking, it sounds a bit familiar and it sounds a little bit like organic farming. But we're not fussy about labels. It will be great to see a huge transformation of farming, and regenerative farming seems to have captured the imagination of a lot of farmers. I think the one key, perhaps, change in which the way we're thinking about agriculture in terms of the work that's coming out of the regenerative movement is this focus on disturbing soil less. And perhaps in the original organic philosophy, there was actually a lot of working of soil. And I think it's not going to be long now before we actually fuse these two ideas. And organic farming is already really innovating in ways of moving soil less. And that's crucial because we know that soil can lock up vast amounts of carbon. And at the moment, soils are bleeding carbon into the atmosphere. They should be locking that away, and that would make a huge contribution to our efforts at the moment to stabilise the climate. And I suppose I'd sum up the way we're thinking about things. Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, said this morning, we need to look at extraordinary innovation in the agriculture and food sector, and we need to look at lifestyle transformation as well. And we need to look at both of those together. And I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who says it's all about technology, or who said, oh, it's all just a question of everyone having to change how they live. Well, we're going to have to do both of those things. Really think about innovating. And we've just heard from my colleagues on the panel about some of the amazing innovative things that are happening at the moment. And not be afraid to say we're actually going to have to change the way we live. And that doesn't necessarily have to be hair shirts and eating muesli. It's actually quite an exciting proposition, because we know that the transformation in diets we need for the climate has extraordinary synergies with the transformation to a healthy diet. Yeah. So talking to citizens and trusting citizens to embrace that change is an equal part of our mission to transform the farming sector as well.
Thank you very much indeed. So as you say, it's not just about technology, it's about ideas. And I know the United Nations Environment Programme is all about pushing the great ideas that we need to develop to decarbonise. Tim, give us a sense of what's going on in UNEP's world at the moment on this theme.
Yes, thank you very much. Our work focuses a lot on changing the rules of the game and working mostly with governments, in fact, because we hear a lot of good private sector initiatives. But if you could summarize it as the private sector rocks, but governments rule, we need to change the rules of the game for this entire industry, for the agri-food systems. And coming out of the UN Food Systems Summit, we have that work mapped out for us. We published a report about 2 months ago with the Food and Agriculture Organization and UNDP, saying that out of the $540 billion of agriculture subsidies we spend per year, or our governments spend per year, about 470 billion are harmful for either markets, biodiversity, climate, or health, or all of the above. So $470 billion ready to be reprogrammed per year. And why that is so important, if we look at the initiatives that are out there to transform agriculture towards regenerative agriculture, to tackle less soil organic carbon emitting into the atmosphere, these are all comparatively small if you look at the amount of agricultural subsidies. We run, for example, a $1 billion fund together with Rabobank called the Agri-3 Fund, where we can incentivize farmers to shift to regenerative agriculture. But if you compare that to 1 billion to 470 billion, it's clear that the big market signals are still pointing in the wrong direction. So we're setting out now to change that with the UN member states. There are some positive leaders in this field already, but it's still not enough. One more point where we focus, I want to mention that here, is if we cannot do everything at the same time, let's focus on peatlands first, because there's a lot of peatlands, including in the European Union, in Britain, that are under the plow. For example, 6% of Germany's emissions come from growing potatoes and other crops on peatlands. That is a very easy thing to stop. Peatlands need to be re-wetted, reconverted to carbon stores, and we have to stop farming on peatlands. It's 3% of the world's land surface, but they contain twice as much carbon as all the world's forests. So this is an easy thing to stop, including in the UK.
Very good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've got Nestle, one of the world's biggest food producers, signed up to regenerative agriculture. We've got the National Trust going zero emissions by 2030. Two incredible startups in Better Origin and Olio developing some fantastic new solutions, and two of the most respected thought leadership bodies all signed up to this as well. So perhaps we could finish this panel before we even get started, but perhaps not. But great to hear that everyone's signed up to this narrative and that there's some really, really exciting ideas flowing for. So let's start off quite literally by getting into the meat of the conversation, let's may I ask the food question around this question. So farming, from farming to transportation without forgetting waste. Let's have a think about that. So we've mentioned the waste question, and Olio's got that great. Better Origin have that great work in that space. What do we do about waste in the farming sector? How do we handle that problem?
Yeah, sorry.
Who would like to go with that one first? Maybe that's one for you, Tessa.
Oh, hi. So yes, I mean, there is waste throughout the food supply chain, and I think for me, it's been quite disappointing, the lack of coverage of waste at COP26, and there hasn't been sufficient coverage of kind of the food systems. So that's disappointing, but I'm actually incredibly heartened by the amount of kind of entrepreneurship and innovation that is taking place. I think it is worth noting that according to Project Drawdown, which ranked the top 100 solutions to the climate crisis, reducing food waste actually came in the sort of #1 position. Now, it's the single most powerful lever humanity can pull to mitigate the worst effects of the climate crisis. If you then look at sort of where food waste takes place, it varies very much according to whether you're in a sort of developed or developing market. And I sort of hate that terminology, but let's work with that for now. So in sort of the developed markets, actually the majority of food waste takes place in the home and at that sort of local level, at the consumption level. And in developing markets, it's the inverse. It takes place sort of at the production and transport stage. If we kind of look at here in the UK, about a third of all food waste takes place before it's even sort of got off the farm gates. And I think some of the biggest changes that can be done to affect that really come down to businesses who apply very, very stringent measures and requirements around sort of cosmetics with regards to the food that they are buying. And farmers can often find themselves in a position where it's just not economic to even sort of complete a harvest because not enough of it sort of meets those stringent requirements. And there's a number of great organizations, Feedback being one of them, that really sort of campaigning around this. And then there's lots of innovators in the supply chain that are helping to sort of extend the shelf life of produce, whether it be, there's a wonderful startup called Appeal, which has got a sort of coating that can be applied to food to kind of harness the power of nature to extend its shelf life, all the way through to some really interesting technologies. There's one called Mimica Touch, which is a packaging solution that sort of bubbles up when the food has actually sort of biochemically gone off and moving us away from the reliance we have at the moment on dates, the best before date and use by date, which the sort of dating paradigms that we have at the moment actually cause an awful lot of food waste when they really shouldn't be. So I think there is no single solution to the problem of food waste. There's a mosaic of solutions that are required everywhere through the supply chain. But if I had a sort of a magic wand to really try and solve this problem, it would be around insisting that businesses, medium and large businesses, have to measure and publish their food waste statistics, because there's that saying that sunlight is the best form of disinfectant, and I think we'd see far more pace of action if we had that degree of transparency and accountability around where food waste is taking place, at what stage in the supply chain.
Thank you, Tessa. So this is obviously core to your business. With Nestle, I imagine as a huge global food production company, this is a major issue. How are you dealing with the issue of food waste?
I totally agree, actually, with what's just been said. You've got in the developing world, we're seeing it very much it is at the farmer end. So we're working actively with our farmers to how can you make sure that you can work with them to you're not seeing waste, whether it be transport related or harvest related around that. But here in the developed world, it's very much at the consumption end. So and what we're doing is we're a couple of things. Firstly, is that we are working with the food redistribution organisations, there's plenty of them in the UK, to make sure that we try and get any of that food waste that we do have through our production facilities to people, and if not people, then to animals. That's the kind of the hierarchy. But also within our own operation, we're focused on the food hierarchy and saying, well, how do we, if we've got any waste, how do we use innovation to try and move up the hierarchy? So, for instance, I'll give you one example. Shredded wheat. We got wheat waste from that. It's quite wet, and it used to be that we would get energy from it. And then we thought about it. Actually, if you dry it, you can turn it into animal feed, and you can therefore move up the hierarchy. So it's about internally how do we become more innovative around reducing that. I mean, ultimately, you don't want the food waste in the first place. That's the main thing, which comes down to forecasting and those kinds of things. But if you have got it, can we get it to people first before anyone else?
Very good. Matt, I've visited many a National Trust cafe and restaurant in my time, and I can assure you with your flapjacks, there's very limited amounts of waste in my consumption of them, but I'm sure on a more fundamental level, it's a big issue for the Trust. How are you addressing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we're looking at in the round. I'd agree with all the previous comments. I mean, really, it's about being smart about diet and preferences that people are expressing. It's about increasing circularity through the system. So if there's ways of handling that waste and putting it back into sort of productive systems or post-processing, and then in looking at kind of how the shelf life of those sort of things. So that's in the round a whole host of things that we're looking at.
I mean, is it one of the big challenges, do you think?
It's not something that I'm currently working on in my field. I mean, I'm more around land use and sustainable systems, but it is looking at it in terms of the whole carbon equation. We've gone back to looking at our menus and the carbon impact of all those menus, and so up front as well as post processing is something we're definitely looking into. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Fotis, what about you in the world of insect feed? How is the issue of waste a challenge for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because food waste for insects is food, actually. And if you think about food waste as a concept, it's a totally man-made problem, right? Food waste doesn't exist in nature. When something rots or biodegrades, insects or the soil would absorb it and put it back again into the food cycle. So I find that fascinating as a concept, and that's kind of what we're doing at Better Origin as well, using insects to upscale again food waste as nutrients into the food cycle. And I think tackling the food waste problems comes from a lot of different angles. It is from mitigating at the source and also reducing transportation as well. And decentralized technology has progressed so much these days that you can actually source and process the food waste at the place that it occurs and use it to feed animals or for the land, again, the place that it occurs. So it really mitigate food waste at the source, but also transportation of those nutrients.
Tim, I assume at the United Nations Environment Programme, this is a subject which you are keenly addressing. What's your thought on that?
No, I was just smiling when Fotiadis said, because, sometimes we say this is a lot of innovation, but this used to be called a compost on a traditional farm, and things, leftover food was fed to the chicken or to the pigs. But that kind of family farming doesn't exist anymore. So I also like to remind us that we are in the UN decade of family farming, which is not very well known, but the concept of a family farm where things are more integrated and not separated by having highly industrialized, large-scale processes that separates livestock from the food, that separates the manure from the fields, that is at the source of many of our problems. So the family farm will hopefully see a revival. I wanted to say on food waste that, again, many of the examples that we hear from the private sector could be supported by a change in norms and in standards. If you look at the requirement of a best before date on almost all food that is sold, much of that is actually not necessary, and it leads to a lot of food waste that could be avoided because supermarkets are required to throw these things out, even if they're still perfectly edible. So That's one thing we're pushing for, to remove the best buy date requirement from a lot of foods where this is absolutely not necessary. I also remember we served a dinner to all the world's environment ministers about 2 years ago here in Nairobi, entirely made of food waste, because at the airport here, where a lot of the vegetables go to the EU, there's tons of food waste of perfectly fresh and edible vegetables that have small blemishes. So we also need to work on the norms, not only the regulation, but also the norms amongst the consumers of what is good food. Because if an apple or an orange has a slight blemish, it will not even make it to the supermarket, because they just assume people are not going to buy it. And for now, that might be true. But if there's a heightened awareness of food waste, and Tessa said it would be the third largest emitter if food waste was a country. About 1/3 of all food goes to waste. If that is better known, I think we can also shift that norm in the population and shift the norm of what is good food, because there's a lot of it that just is thrown away.
I think you're referencing Gareth's point there. Gareth, to your point on it's not just about technology, it's about ideas around this system as well. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, Tim's absolutely right. The concept of circular farming needs to be re-embedded in the nature of farming itself. Food waste, to me, is a no-brainer issue. Most of the land use and farming solutions on climate change have got a downside. I can't see the downside on tackling food waste. It's a difficult issue potentially, but it is solvable. I think connecting people back with food is part of it, and Soil Association's involved in. You've got a program called Food for Life, which is about reconnecting people to food through better provision in schools and so on. I know from my own experience, if you planted a carrot seed and nurtured it and dug it, you don't throw it away. And I think part of the problem is people become very disconnected between what they see on their plate and where it comes from. So I think reconnecting people to food is part of the challenge of actually tackling the food waste issue. But as I said, I just think it's a no-brainer. Every bit of food we save saves a bit of methane release, or a bit of wasted carbon in the production, or a bit of wasted nitrate fertilizer, which ends up in the atmosphere. So the more we can tackle that,
I think we've lost you there, but I pretty much entirely agree with what you said, apart from the carrot point, because you haven't met my children
we need to tackle
who did actually plant their own carrots and then subsequently refused to eat them, much to my annoyance. Let's move on to a bigger question, looking at responsibility. So the agriculture industry is responsible for 10% of UK greenhouse gas emissions. Does the responsibility for that lie with producers running the farms, policymakers, or consumers in choosing what we want to eat? How about you go with that one first, Robin?
My view is that there is no single area. I think everyone has got their role to play when it comes to this. But it's, but I know from a sorry, could you just say the question again? I'm getting confused with food waste.
Let me add in global food producers as well. Is the responsibility with global food producers, with farmers, with policymakers, or with the consumers?
Yeah. I mean, I think as a big food company, the big food manufacturers got a massive role to play in this, and there's a role for them to really start to communicate as well. But I think the important thing, and I always try and remember it and try and remind people, is that farmers need to be at the heart of this solution, and they can't be told what to do. They need to be part of the solution, and it's got to work for them as well. So one of the key things that we have to do, and we're doing as an organisation, is you've got to invest behind the farmers as well. So if they're going to make this change, and particularly when it comes to things like soil and soil management, for a lot of them, particularly dairy farmers, and I work closely with dairy farmers, they've never really focused on this. So they don't have the expertise. So not only money alone isn't enough as well, you've also got to give advice and support and work with the right organisations who've got that expertise to help support them through it. So that making farmers right at the centre of it is absolutely fundamental.
Could you give us a material example of how you're working with farmers?
Yeah, so here, just 50 miles from here where we're sat right now, we've got our dairy farmers, 50 farmers, who provide all the milk for Kit Kat, Quality Street, Yorkie. And we've been working with them for 7 years now. And what we do is we pay them a sustainability bonus. So they get their milk price, but they get a bonus for sustainability. But we went out and we actually started working with the Allerton project, they came along as the advisors to work with the farmers in terms of, so the farmers they had a menu of options. They've got a menu of options. They could either put in more hedgerows or fence off waterways, so it's all about not just soil, it's about water protection, biodiversity as well. And so every year they've been working on improvements, and now we're really focusing on soil big time, and we actually believe that we can potentially halve our footprint in the next 5 years if we actively focus on soil. And we've been working with an organisation called AgriCarbon who've been doing soil sample of our farmers' fields. And back to the point made earlier, the areas that have got peatland, way more carbon than the other fields. But even the farmers that have been implementing, we call it mob grazing, where you move the cows around. We did analysis 7-8 years ago of some of those fields. We've just recently done them again. And those fields where we've had the mob grazing have got more carbon than the fields where they haven't done it. So we're already seeing all the stuff that we know to be true, we're actually seeing proper results coming from it, which is fantastic.
Perhaps, Matt, I could come on to the question of how you're working with your farmers, but just to return to the question about the responsibility piece, where do you think responsibility lies?
Well, I think, specifically around the agricultural sector, it's obviously it's a system, so it's absolutely a shared responsibility. And I think, obviously, the government, I agree around farmers, but I think government has really got a key driving role here, because I think the market will not drive many of those measures that we need at the pace, really, at sufficient pace. I think many of the things we've talked about, the integration of those systems, regenerative or agroecological, I think we've got to use all the tools in the box, really, but, and many of those practices are well understood and developed, and really what it needs is that financial and knowledge barriers removed. So from a sort of policy system, the farm system payments, the way we incentivize for innovation, for kind of delivering both nature and carbon benefits and people benefits, education around improved input reduction, and soil management is amongst those. I think in terms of carbon and fertilizer auditing, about better knowledge around greenhouse gas fluxes and sequestration, and that comes down also to training advice. And I think there's another bit we touched on earlier, really, about diet choice and education around food. And I think for the government, we've had the National Food Strategy, we've had a stack of those sorts of reviews that really sort of point the way. And I think longer term, I think that in the medium and longer term then, I think also it's around innovating and targeting and funding decent research that actually moves us on to those innovations. But I would argue strongly at the moment, we kind of have quite a lot of the necessary building blocks. It's the pace and those blockers. But I think there's also the land managers that we've talked about, and thinking about how we protect those resources that we already have, that we renovate and restore the ones that are degraded, and that we create new habitats that are integrated into farming systems. There's a duality here because that makes sense from a kind of an ecological point of view. The underpinning of biodiversity for all these systems is really important. And then the third one with consumers we've talked about. It's partly about education, about knowledge, about engagement with food, and access to nutritious food, apart from just sort of affordable food.
Very good. I think I need to educate my children a little bit more on eating carrots, but I certainly don't on needing to educate them to eat Quality Street. Gareth, so Matt was veering heavily towards the policy piece side of things in answer to that question there. Is that where you see the big question that needs to be addressed?
Well, I think the answer to the question is all of the above. I mean, what matters is what happens in the field. So clearly farmers are pivotal in this, and Soil Association is very involved in what we call the Innovative Farmers Programme, which is really getting farmers to network and innovate on farm, and then peer-to-peer learning about how to change things. So, for example, this sweet spot between regenerative, no disturbance agriculture and organic. How do you actually develop the system that can actually farm in an organic manner, but with less disturbance of the soil? So there's a lot that can be done at the farm level. But we do need to bear in mind that farmers are mostly in a pretty invidious position in the food chain. They're at the end of a long series of consumer corporate decisions that drive what they do. So I think it's really naive to just expect that farming will transform without the transformation of those other bits in the food chain. So there's an enormous responsibility, certainly on players like Nestle, and it's really interesting to hear of the innovations that Nestle is talking about there, but also us as consumers, because we talk a lot about the importance of better farming, but do we actually make that decision when we're in the supermarket choosing between stuff? And there is a responsibility on the consumer there and a responsibility on the other players in the food chain to make sure farmers are getting the right signal to do the right thing, and at the minute, they're not.
Fotis, you're feeding insects to farm animals. I imagine you spend a lot of time educating or trying to educate farmers on new ideas. Is that the case, or do you see these other instruments, policy, consumer education, do you see those as equally important?
I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree more with Gareth, actually, that indeed a lot of stuff are happening at the farm, but actually we know that farmers are operating in very tight margins, and it's quite hard for them to adopt new technologies. So as we've on many occasions highlighted today, it's a system. And I think for this to be successful, the challenge is so large that everyone needs to play their own part. And yes, farmers, the ones at least we're communicating with, are always keen to explore new technologies. But if the policy is not in place to help them with some incentives, if the large companies are not there to support them, and if the consumers are not driving the demand in the stores, then it doesn't really work very well. So I think everyone needs to play their part in order for this to be a success. And yes, it starts with the farmers, but policymakers and having the right incentives in place can go a really long way in accelerating the process of adoption.
Tessa, where do you think the big responsibility lies with governments, with consumers, with farmers, with large global food producers? All of the above?
All of the above, but actually I am really, really, really passionate about the role of the consumer, because I think that more and more people are waking up to sort of the climate crisis, and they are feeling really quite overwhelmed, and they're looking at a system and thinking, what difference do I make? How can I possibly change the system? And to bring it back to food waste specifically, we see that people kind of throw away 2 browned bananas and they think, well, what difference does that make? It's just me. But it isn't. You know, in the UK, there are 28 million households throwing away a couple of brown bananas every week. And it is through individual action that kind of scales up to collective impact that I think real change can happen. And specifically, when it comes to kind of food and food choices and food waste, there's a certain sort of, because I've thought very deeply about how do we drive change. And I think that there is a cohort of early adopters, and they might be 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people. But if they start moving their money, like, you know, thinking of every pound as a vote, and instead of buying this, I'm going to, you know, that's kind of continuing to contribute to the current destructive system, I'm going to move my pound and buy something else that contributes to the positive future we all want, then what you might think it's just me, what difference does it make? No, through every time you spend your money, you're sending data back up to those corporates, to the likes of Nestle, for example, who look at that data very, very, very closely. And when they start to see money moving, they follow that and they innovate and they bring new products to market. And that is then what makes sort of sustainability accessible to the mainstream. And I think the power of the consumer has never been more important, because governments and businesses, have been woefully remiss in terms of the inaction that they have demonstrated in this space. And it is only through increasing consumer pressure that we're going to see this pace accelerate. So, you know, every single thing you do counts.
Tessa, I think you'd have been a little bit more confident about the power of consumers in our panel this morning, looking at investment. There was a very uplifting narrative there about how consumers were really powering investment decisions. Tim, coming on to you, I mean, you're a global organisation, the United Nations Environment Programme. You look at consumer behaviour, presumably across the world. What do you think about that consumer behaviour piece? Do you think that's a very varying picture around the world in terms of food choices?
Absolutely, and I agree with Tessa, and I think Fotis and Gareth also said that everybody has to play their part. That is certainly true. what we do, for example, with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which my team and I, and also with FAO, we lead with now over 80 partners, and regenerative agriculture plays a big role there as well. Our theory of change is that the political will we need to see is driven by a global movement. So we need to generate that shift in individual consumer behavior to shift political will, and at the same time provide the financial and technical capacity for this shift. The nice thing about all this is that is not only natural systems that work with tipping points, social systems also work with tipping points, so that once you're over a tipping point, all the industries, even all the governments, everybody will want to be part of that and catch up. And I think we're very close to a tipping point like that in the agri-food system. But the biggest obstacle in our way right now, even if we have, we see heightened consumer awareness, are agricultural subsidies, and that they're programmed for the wrong incentives, mostly. Not always and not everywhere, but they are programmed for policy objectives that were important in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, especially, of course, in the EU, where food security is still the number 1 policy objective of the Common Agricultural Policy, together with keeping the rural Europe alive. But that needs to be adapted and needs to be reformed very urgently, because as long as Gareth also said, as long as the farmers don't see the incentives, they do not want to, but for the most part, they cannot change because they've made heavy investments in business as usual. They are squeezed from all sides, so they need the public policy incentive in the form of subsidy change.
Very good. So we'll move on now to some questions from our online audience, and it's actually a subject which I was going to touch on myself, looking at plant-based diets. The question asks, are plant-based diets seen as a middle-class luxury, and what can be done to change this perception? Perhaps overlooks the fact that over 1 billion people in India are consuming plant-based foods in the main. Robin, what would you like to say on that point?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think here in the UK, it's plant-based often is more expensive, which does make it difficult. And let's not forget, every single week, even in this, this is supposed to be an advanced nation, we've got people going to food banks every single week in this country. So, and so that access to plant-based or plant alternatives is not accessible at the moment, and that really does need to change. And that's a combination of, again, it's everyone in the process. It's manufacturers making it more straightforward as well, but it's the retailers stepping up in terms of making it commercially viable. And then it's back to consumers and education around, because you can, I mean, when you walk in an aisle, vegetables on the whole, if you're just buying vegetables, are pretty much the cheapest things you can buy in a supermarket. But what do you do with it, and how do you use it? And I've got kids like you as well, as how do you get the kids to eat it and the rest? So so people have got roles to play, but yeah, it's the move towards plant-based, not only the planetary reasons for it, but it's got and the health benefits, but it has, at the moment, my view is it is a little bit of a middle-class luxury potential.
Well, perhaps the very naming of it makes it middle class, because really some of the cheapest meals that I cook are a simple pasta dish and beans on toast, which are essentially plant-based foods, but not given that epithet. Fotis, I mean, is this a question that works in your world? Your business is an insect-based business. Do you have any interactions with the plant-based sector?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a lot of people who are eating meat, and humans need animal protein as well to have a complete nutrition. And what we find really interesting is that insects, the protein found in insects is animal-based, it's animal grade. It's the same amino acid as a steak, let's say. Only you use 95% less land and 99% less water to farm them. So I think instead of saying that every single human being needs to move away from an animal diet to a plant diet, which is going to take years and it's going to be very challenging, and I don't even know if we have enough land to have that much plant-based diets. I think there has to be a very strong push to move towards sustainable sourcing of animal protein, whether that is through better ways of farming current meats or shifting to things like insect protein, where you still get a nutritional benefit, but also the sustainability benefit as well by it being much more green in its way of production.
Matt, as I understand it, plant uses less agricultural land. What's your take on this subject?
Well, it does. It does use a lot less. I mean, in the UK, about 48% of our land area is used for animal agriculture, and about over 50% of our crops actually go to animals. So actually, that's not right. I guess, though I'm not going to get into the weeds amongst that. I guess there's a tandem thing here, isn't it? It's not just about solely plant-based. It's about increasing the amount of plant-based stuff in your diet. And over 80% of the adults in the UK don't eat the standard sort of 3.5 portions of fruit that the government already kind of suggest. And those, despite those 5 a day, and despite the live, eat well kind of guidance, so really that combination actually means that about 3.5% of our GDP goes to tackling directly the health disbenefits of not including those. So it doesn't need to be even as radical as a 100% plant-based thing. It's about including kind of nutritious, affordable food within your diet, and plants have a massive part to play there, as well as being a more efficient way, potentially.
Do you see consumers shifting more towards plant-based diets in their food selection choices at National Trust properties?
So I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect so. We're seeing that all through the market, and we're providing many more of those options, like a lot of retailers. I guess, you know, the Committee on Climate Change has assumed that switch should be of a proportion of around 30%, you know, much less meat, to meet those net zero goals of sort of 2050. So, but that's again through a market kind of mechanism, and I agree, the consumer is potentially king here. I'd question whether that pace is there, but I think we are at a potential social tipping point, as Tim has said. We've seen that here, and that's undoubtedly rippling out, and we must respond to that in a kind of positive way, I think.
Gareth, I know the Soil Association isn't just about a plant-based agricultural system. You also look after livestock as well. What's your sense of that question?
I'd agree with Matt there. I'd reframe the question slightly, and I'd say, are people entitled to a plant-rich, affordable diet? Yes, they are. And at the minute, that's not the easy thing to do. And there's various reasons lying behind that. And one of them is because I think industrial meat and dairy is underpriced, and because we're not pricing in the environmental and health costs of those systems. I heard I think it was the owner of Bernard Matthews saying the other day that they're now producing chickens too cheaply. They can't produce them at the price they've got them down to. The era of the £2 chicken is dead, and we've got to get off that sort of treadmill. Yeah. Now, that isn't to say there isn't an important role for livestock, and certainly in organic systems, ruminant livestock are absolutely key to that process of cycling nutrients. And for those people that want to, an element of meat in their diet can have an important role. But at the minute, I think we're in a situation where governments have got are falling behind the appetite of people for change on this. And it was really disappointing that the immediate government response to the National Food Strategy was from Henry Dimbleby was, it's not for us to tell people what to eat. It's not about telling people what to eat. It's making sure that when they go food shopping, they've got the right selection of vegetables and sustainably produced meat and dairy that they can create a healthy diet for themselves. And at the minute, government's shying away from that important role in shaping those choices that people make.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Tessa, plant-based diets, middle-class luxury or not?
I think it's perceived that way, but it absolutely shouldn't be. And my view on this topic comes really from my own personal experience with my family. So we have spent the past sort of 3 or 4 years really changing the way we live and eat. We've reduced our meat and fish consumption, beans, pulses, lentils, etc. And we are finding that we are sort of healthier, wealthier, happier as a result of doing this transition. But the key change that was required was for me to change the way I cooked. So I used to sort of get home at the end of a busy day and have half an hour to pull together what would broadly be sort of meat or fish and 2 veg, which I think is how many, many families here in the UK eat. And instead, I found myself, when I wanted to go plant-based, I had no idea how to do it. And I certainly couldn't do it in half an hour at the end of the day. And what I've transitioned to is actually doing a lot of batch cooking on the weekend. Then I don't have to cook during the week, but that then gives me the time and opportunity to follow recipes and to invest in herbs and spices and all those sorts of things. And so I think what is critical to making this work, one, I think sort of trying to expect everyone to become vegan is just unrealistic. You know, if everybody reduced their meat and fish consumption by 50, 60, 70, 80%, you know, this would be problem solved. So I don't think we need to be positioning it as black and white in a very judgmental way and associating it with that kind of middle class sort of ethicism. And I think
we've lost Tessa there. Tessa,
so that our children are being brought up with the ability to know how to cook plant-based diets.
Thanks. We lost a little bit of what you said there, Tessa, but not the overall sentiment, so thank you. Tim, I mean, again, you'll have a global perspective on this from a UN Environment Programme position. What's your take on that question?
I think it's all frozen down.
Tim, are you there? Can you hear that question? We'll move on. We'll move on to another question. Tim, did you hear the question?
I didn't, sorry. There was a slight glitch.
The plant-based food question, middle class luxury or not? I guess from a UN Environment Programme and a global perspective, you'll have a very different take on that question.
Well, in most parts of the world, plants and vegetables are a lot cheaper than meat. So I think it's more the other way around, that meat is still seen as a luxury in many parts of the world, and it is, and it should be, because I fully agree with Gareth that it's just too cheap because it's subsidized heavily. And the externalities, the negative externalities of food production are not priced in. We leave that to our children to pay or to the society at large. You followed probably the nitrogen ruling in the Dutch Supreme Court that said that it's just no longer constitutional for the government to put the health of their citizens at risk through high nitrogen pollution. So the government will have to take drastic steps now to limit either the number of livestock or other nitrogen pollution sources. And I think we're coming to that end of the road where this pushing the externalities onto our children or onto the taxpayer is no longer acceptable. And that will mean, yes, meat might become more expensive, but I agree with Tessa that we need to position this as a happier, healthier, wealthier choice for everybody and not as a limitation. Let's also communicated that way. I think that will be essential.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think you can just completely reframe the question there, didn't you, from a global perspective rather than perhaps from a global north perspective. A final question from our audience, which is looking at that locally produced question. And the question is, how can we encourage consumption of locally produced food in order to reduce delivery or food miles? Is it a case of educating local communities or increasing subsidies for local farmers? Tim, how about I give you a first stab on that one, please?
So again, looking at this from a global perspective, there are almost 1 billion smallholder farmers in the world. It's by far the largest employment sector. Every third job is in agriculture. And the future of food and the future of a food system will be making the lives of these people better and helping them to produce climate smart, nature positive food that they can sell at a good price, make a decent living. And we know how to do this. This is imminently doable, but if we need to work all together, the large supply chains, the governments, the farmers, and if we do this, you might be familiar with the example of Andhra Pradesh in India, which is a state with about 55 million people. And they have 6 million smallholder farmers. They farm 8 million hectares. And a few years ago, the government set out to transform that entire sector into what they call zero budget natural farming, which is more or less organic agriculture, but it leaves more money in the hands of the local farmer. And the government acts as an aggregator for the food so that it can be sold to the Starbucks, to the Olams, to the Nestles of this world, because they cannot go to 6 million smallholder farmers themselves, but the government negotiates a fair price for them on their behalf, and they secure large supply chain security for these big companies that need predictability, that need clarity on the quality. So here is a great role for the governments to step in and make sure we have smallholder farmers not only playing their part, but having a decent living out of it. Because this is 1 billion people we're talking about, and they are central to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Robin, you're a large global food producer. This is a question which I'm sure gives you, which exercises you in some sense. What's your answer to this question?
Yeah, it's where we can buy local, it makes absolute sense. And actually, it's really interesting time, I think, because commercially, as a large organisation with global supply chains, we have traditionally in the past, you focused your procurement spend on where can you get economies of scale, where can you buy stuff at such a scale, and you're transporting it around. And we're talking about externalities and all the rest. We, like a lot of food manufacturers, didn't really factor in the costs of the transport, all the sustainability, both the environmental and the social impacts that you're having. Now, because it's a focus for us as a company, but globally as well, we are now having those kind of quite challenging conversations about what is the right decision here, whether it's you continue to, you buy locally, or do you get that supply chain where you're getting stuff from potentially other countries. What we're also doing, which I think is really interesting as well, is that, traditionally we might have seen a coffee farmer as we're just buying coffee from them, but that farmer may well be producing other herbs, spices, you name it. So why don't we buy more different products from them? So you're helping them locally as well. So it's really about changing mindsets. At the end of the day, there's still always the commercial element that you've got to factor in. But, and this is where, this is a much broader conversation we've had in COP for for the last 2 weeks, is that broader, how do you measure how a company is successful? It isn't just about the financial metrics anymore. It is about your impact on nature, your impact on society. So that's all, I guess ultimately the upshot of it is where we can go local. We're seeing definitely a move towards that. And interesting enough, even here in many countries where consumers want to know that they're buying local as well. So the fact is, we haven't done a good job of telling everyone that every time we have a Kit Kat, that's Scottish milk in there. Consumers love to hear that here in the UK, that it's consumers themselves as well want that local aspect. But are they willing to pay for it? Hopefully, yes.
Matt, I know the National Trust does a good job of storytelling of local food production. Can you tell us more about what your
so I think in the general thing, local can be good. I wouldn't say it's an automatic. If you look at the kind of, but in terms of encouraging and our tenants and the produce from our land, yes, the shorter those food chains can be, the better it is. I would say more generally though, it's about how it's produced. in terms of emissions and general emissions, that kind of equation is actually much more loaded to how things are produced, and I think there's efficiencies there that need to be looked at in the whole. But from the National Trust point of view, yes, the shorter we can, the food chains we can internalise and use our tenants' produce, absolutely, yeah.
Very good. We need to start thinking about wrapping up now, but I'm keen to ask all of the panel in terms of ideas that they've heard from their fellow panel members. Are there some ideas that you've heard today, Robin, that excite you, maybe from the startups or the National Trust or the Soil Association, that you think are ideas that you might want to progress within Nestle?
I think for me, the main thing is actually everyone seems broadly aligned on all of this, which is good to hear. I think more than anything, we need to, it all fits together, whether it be food waste or working to improve the soil or having more insect-based ingredients. So for me, it's more about driving collaboration more than ever before, and driving and really starting to share best practice and what we're doing more and more. I think that's one of the big takeouts for me.
There is a real sense of collaboration and being on the same page in this panel, which is great. Matt, are there any ideas here that you've heard that you think you'd like to follow up on?
Yeah, well, I think it's about, just following that, I think it's a system problem we have, and we've got elements of those systems, and understanding kind of what it is that's driving those through the chain is critical. And I think if we can be collaborative along that, I think the key points that we flashed up as well is about education and incentivisation at a number of scales as well.
Gareth, it seems that some of your pioneering ideas at the Soil Association have really found a home in COP26. Any ideas that you've heard today that you think are interesting from a Soil Association perspective?
Well, I'm excited to hear about this tartan Kit Kat. I'm going to make it my mission to make sure it's an organic tartan Kit Kat.
Yeah.
I think there's a really important role for corporates in this, but also an important role for governments in shaping the environment in which people make their choices. And I thought Tessa's sort of journey that she described about how there are big changes for people ahead, and people need to be helped on those changes. And government's job is to help people make the right choices. And that's got to be our urgent mission now over the next few years.
Tim, on urgent missions, what's the idea that is most interesting at the moment from this panel, from a UN Environment Programme perspective?
I would like to take this panel and show it to a national level decision maker, a Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Finance that is responsible for subsidies, and say, look, everybody agrees, we only need you to change the enabling environment and we're ready to go. We have SME startups here who invest in innovative agriculture. We have landowners, agriculture associations, large producers, the food systems sector with Nestle. So everybody is really ready to go. We need the government at the national and at the regional, also at the global level, to open the, to create the enabling environment for this to accelerate at a massive scale. So the amount of alignment on this panel was quite encouraging. That would probably not have happened 5 or 10 years ago.
Fotis, it looks like we're all, well, you'll have a market, increasing market for your insect-based business. Any ideas on this panel that are particularly interesting for you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Tim, and I think that the most positive thing out of this panel is that it was so diverse and everyone is very aligned into what is happening, and it just really feels different this time, that now is the time to change and everyone is on board with it. So I actually feel really positive about it.
And Tessa, everyone's been inspired by your personal story of transformation. Which transformative ideas have you heard this morning that are of interest to you?
Well, I want to thank Tim for providing me with a data point, but it's been on my to-do list forever to look up and find out how big it is, the agricultural subsidies that are used in such a way that create all these negative externalities. You know, so it's 470 billion. I think there's a lot of conversation about fossil fuel subsidies. And for a long time, I've very intuitively felt we have got to be hammering on about agricultural subsidies. And the way I see it, you know, this is not just about transforming our food system. It's also going to transform our health system. Because I see, you know, slightly cynical maybe, but these two evil twins of our food system and the pharmaceutical industry, and they are mutually reinforcing one another. And we've created a globally very sick an unwell population. And if we can start really moving those subsidies, then I think we will all be healthier, wealthier and happier. And that has to be a great thing to work towards.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much to all of our panellists on this food and agriculture panel here at the Decarbonisation Summit. To not excuse the pun, it's been a very fruitful conversation. So thank you very much indeed. And we will return at 1:15 UK time to discuss how we reduce emissions from buildings and the built environment. So please do join us for that. Thank you very much, panelists.